For Atlanta, the question I'm going to settle in on is, will the Hawks be able to run Young, Murray, and Bogdanovich at the same time, or will that be just too much of a defensive liability? That lineup allows Atlanta to be the best version of themselves offensively, but is very small, and all of them can be picked on in a mismatch hunting offense, and that's more prevalent in the postseason. So that's something to really worry about. I think they'll need to at least try it though, because it gives them the best chance to put up points, but it could be problematic as well. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. My question for the Bulls is how they'll handle Vucevic and DeRozan being non-shooters. In addition to Vooch's inability to shoot, he is a mess on switches, which will be more strongly targeted in the playoffs than it has been in the regular season. So I'm wondering, will Chicago give more minutes to Drummond, who is at least athletic enough to keep up with the necessary switches? Or less likely, would Chicago get daring and go small with Torrey Craig playing some small ball five? Regardless, playing Vucevic big minutes seems like a recipe for disaster, so Chicago is probably going to have to do something a little bit creative or out there for them to have any real chance of having success in the playoffs. Miami's question is pretty simple. Who is their closing lineup? I trust Coach Spoelstra to get it correct, but there's 9 to 10 guys in the mix for those vital minutes. If I had to guess, I'd say it'll largely be Hero, Robinson, Butler, Martin, and Bam. But Martin could be substituted with Rozier, Hawkes, Highsmith, or even Love, depending on what's needed that game. It isn't a bad thing to have lineup versatility, but it definitely makes things trickier because there's a lot of ways that the Heat can configure things, and I'm really not sure what they're going to settle in. I have, I guess, a pretty solid guess, but again, that's a guess that could be really going either direction with one player, and who's to say that Martin's going to be the odd man out? Maybe he's playing well and he sticks in. With Philly, you could go with the obvious how long will Embiid be able to play and how well will he perform when he does play, but that's boring. What isn't boring, though, is asking if they'll run extended periods of 3-guard lineups because of Kelly Oubre's lacking 3-point shot that could crowd the paint for Embiid. Embiid posting up and having Maxey, Hield, and some combination of DeAnthony Melton, Kyle Lowry, and Cameron Payne, and then obviously Tobias Harris as their forward 2-pass-2 sounds like an absolute nightmare to defend. And it really allows for good playmaking around Embiid, which is a must to get him the appropriate looks he can't always create for himself. So I think that's something that Philly should really consider because I think it could really make them basically impossible to defend. As for the Pacers, their question is how their offense will look in a playoff setting that's traditionally much slower paced than a regular season is. Indy had the second fastest pace in the association, so they'll want to push the ball continually, but other teams are going to be more prepared and will be less worried with offensive boards and instead will hustle back on defense. So it'll be interesting to see how the Pacers respond with a more half-court centered offense than normal. Don't get me wrong, too. I think the Pacers have more than enough talent to still perform at a very high level offensively. It's just going to be interesting to see how they do when their primary focus is just not going to be something they can do as frequently. I think Halliburton has more than enough skill to run the offense in the half court, but he really is more of a run and gun type of point guard, so this is going to be interesting. Are the Magic going to be able to survive with Franz Wagner and Markelle Fultz getting serious minutes? Wagner is shooting an awful 28% from 3 this year on 4.6 attempts a game, and Fultz is even worse as he basically does not shoot them at all, attempting 0.4 threes a game. Teams are going to sag off of them pretty seriously because they're going to realize that they just cannot make these types of shots, and that'll make Paulo's life very difficult as he deals with a crowded paint, and he already struggles a bit with efficiency, and I could see that just being ramped up as the playoffs go along because not only are his traits going to be identified more heavily by the defenses are just going to be completely sagging off of 2 players, and that's going to be super difficult to combat. For Cleveland, Was Mitchell's falling apart in last year's playoff a blip on an otherwise good playoff performer's career, or is that an issue of the Cavs' construction? Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley are both non-shooters, so how much of Mitchell's inability to produce in the paint like usual was a result of more than half of the defense being there? I could really see a world in which Mitchell's struggles are just because teams are able to sell out and put lots of bodies in the paint. But I could also see a world in which that was just a bad matchup for the Cavs as a whole, where the Knicks were being more physical than the Cavs were, and that got the Cavs in a lot of trouble. I don't know. I'm really going to be interested to see and how things play out because I'm not certain what's what. Regarding the Knicks, will they be able to generate enough offense? They're 8th in offensive rating, so it doesn't seem like there's much of an issue there, but there's very limited scoring options after Brunson. After him, Miles McBride is the only other player that can really create off the dribble, and he is scoring just 8 points a night. If Brunson doesn't go nuclear, it'll be hard for New York to keep pace with high-scoring teams, so it's really going to be interesting to see if the Knicks are able to keep pace with these teams. Obviously, the Knicks have a great defense, so they should be able to prevent teams from really just going out and boat racing them. But I think at the end of the day, you're going to have to put up some points. And it's really going to be difficult after Brunson and McBride. So those two are really going to have great series if the Knicks want to have any success. With Milwaukee, will the Lillard acquisition pay dividends? The Bucks opted for a swap of defensive Drew Holiday for offensive Damian Lillard, and I think that was the right move from a talent perspective, but Dame can be taken advantage of pretty heavily defensively. So will Lillard's and Holiday's weaknesses simply cancel out, or will Damian be able to take the Bucks to a new level with 4 of the 5 players on the team being able to shoot, and Dame having flashes of concerns for defense as well? Because really, if he locks in, he can be a solid defender. He has the requisite athleticism to be a solid defender. He's not overly small, and he has the intellect to be a solid defender as well. It's just mainly a question of if he's concerned with it or not. For Boston, I hate this one because it's such a common question, but it's the only one I can think of for this juggernaut. What's the offense going to look like in crunch time? Sure, you do want the ball in your best player's hand, but when Tatum has the ball, the rest of the O can be a little bit stagnant. With Derek White having the ball, though, teams can sag off of him a bit because just 20% of his threes are unassisted. So there seems like there's an issue with whatever they do, because really the same applies for White as it does for Holiday or Jaylen Brown, with Jaylen Brown having also the cause for concern with his turnovers. So there's really, it seems like an issue with whatever they do, albeit they are at least the best team in the East. So it's not the biggest issue, but it's still something.